Today I'm going to show you the markdown panel in HISE. Now I've had a lot of requests to do a tutorial about this particular feature. This is a tool for making documentation that's built into your plugins. So that means you don't have to provide PDF files, you don't have to provide an online manual, and the documentation is just accessible to your user from within the plugin or the standalone application that you've provided them with. There's also a feature to update the documentation from an external server, so the user will always have the latest documentation and you don't have to recompile the plugin just to update the documentation. Now, saying all of that, there are loads of bugs with this feature at the moment. The markdown panel is buggy. So as we go through this video, I'm going to show you all the features I can, and I'm going to point out all the bugs that are there. And I still recommend you play around with this, and in some cases it'll still be perfectly usable to put in an end product. But for some people it won't be usable. It'll depend on the situation. But once the next version of HISE comes out, I'm hoping that all these bugs will be fixed, and I'm hoping that this tutorial and this demonstration of the markdown panel will show off the potential of this feature and also at least make you familiar with how to use it. So I don't have a project here, so let's create a project. And I'll just create this on my desktop. I'll just call it Markdown Tutorial. And we'll hit OK. Let's take a look at that folder. So here it is. And we'll get rid of that one. So we're just looking at the HISE project we've created here. And we've got this documentation folder. This is where all of our documentation for the project is going to go. It's going to go inside here in a particular folder structure, which we'll look at shortly. So back in HISE, we're going to add a user interface to our project. And the catch with using the markdown panel is it goes into the same interface as your main interface. So it won't be like a separate floating window. So that means you've got to make the window big enough to accommodate your documentation. So if you're doing a really tiny plugin, maybe you're doing something like a virtual rack unit perhaps, that's not really going to be suitable to use the markdown panel effectively. So I'm going to go for something a bit larger, 800 by 600 in this case. So that's a decent size to make use of the markdown panel. Okay, let's just make a bit more room here. I'll make that let's make that 700 just so it fits on a bit better. There we go. Right, so the first thing we need to add is a floating tile. So we add the floating tile and we can make it whatever size we want. And if you're doing a tabbed interface, you could obviously put this inside a panel, and that could perhaps be a separate tab that shows the documentation for your project when the user opens that tab. But we're just going to have it taking up pretty much the whole interface here. From the content type drop down, we can select Markdown panel right here at the bottom. And we've got a few options to customize it. We'll look at those shortly. And let's just rename this tile just to Markdown, FLT Markdown. And I'll save this project. So this is our Markdown panel. This is where we can construct our documentation and layout so the user can find their way around it. So let's have a look at some of the properties we have. I'm just going to close the script editor for now. So the layout of this floating tile is we have this toolbar along the top. We have a table of contents is going to be on the left hand side in this grey panel. And in this darker panel here is where the actual documentation will be. So looking at these properties, we have this option show back, and we can set that to true or false, and this hides or shows both this back button and the forward button. Let's zoom this in a bit. So it will hide both of these. So let's set that to false and we can see that. So they're gone. Show search actually hides or shows the entire toolbar. So we'll set that to false and we can see it's disappeared. Let's set that one back to true. Show table of contents or show TOC is to show or hide this table of contents area on the left. So there we go, that's gone. Let's bring it back. Bold font name is for setting a particular font for headings. Fix TOC width is if you want to set a specific width for the table of contents column here, and that's great if you want it to fit in with a particular design. So let's set that to 200 for example, and we can see it goes a bit narrower. I'll set that back to the default, which is -1. Okay, start URL we'll look at shortly, and server update URL, that's what you'd set if you were going to publish your documentation to a public server that the project could then automatically download from to update the documentation for your user when a new version is released. I haven't been able to get that to work, but it's something for a future video. Okay, let's bring our show back and forward buttons, set those back to true. So now we're back where we started. Okay, before we go any further, I'll just show you the help documents that are available in HISE. If you press F1 on your keyboard or go up to help and then show documentation, you will get this panel appear, and this, you may notice, has the same layout as our floating tile. So the built-in HISE documentation actually uses essentially one of these markdown panels, and it has pretty much the exact same layout. And of course there is documentation in here specifically for the markdown panel. So we can have a quick look at that. And it goes into a lot more detail about how to create your documentation and export it and stuff like that. Now to get started, it's nice to have a documentation template. And what I actually like to use is the official HISE markdown tutorial. There is a tutorial available. If you go to Christoph's GitHub page, github.com/ChristophHart, there's a repository called HISE tutorial. I'll post a link for it in the description on YouTube. And if you download this whole repository by going to clone or download and download zip, you'll get all these folders which have various HISE projects in, which are also tutorial projects. And the one in here that we're interested in today is the documentation tutorial. Now I've already downloaded this. Here it is. There's the documentation tutorial. And the folder we're interested in inside here is the documentation folder. So I mentioned that one earlier. And here there are a bunch of folders in here. Now all I'm going to do is copy these and transfer them over to our project that we're working on. And I'm going to put them inside the documentation folder of our project. So let's go back to HISE for a moment. And I'm just going to hit this refresh button. And now it's loaded in that documentation that we've just imported from the tutorial project. So we can see it's called documentation tutorial. Now, the only thing I want you to notice at the moment is this table of contents. We've got setup, using the TOC, embed files, how to link and update the documentation. And if we go back to the folder, you can see we have one called embed, which links to this embed files heading. We've got one called link, which is going to link to this how to link heading. We've got setup, which is the setup heading. Sync is update the documentation. And TOC is this using the TOC. Don't worry about the template one for now. The other important thing is when we first look at the documentation, we can see there is some text already displayed here. And that's in this readme.md file. So let's see how all this connects together. So all of the documentation, all of the text, is made up of these .md files, and MD stands for markdown. Markdown is a type of language for laying out documents, and it's really simple. It's not a programming language, it's a markup language essentially. Like HTML is a markup language for laying out web pages, Markdown is a markup language for laying out documents. So these MD files are what constitute our documentation. So if we go into each of these folders, we're going to find a readme.md in all the ones that have text in them. So if we go into some of these folders, we're going to find documents called readme.md. And readme is the default name. You can use other names. Okay, and we can open these in just a text editor, and we could just edit them like this, but HISE actually has a built-in markdown editor which has syntax highlighting and stuff like that. So let's look at how we get to that editor. So if I open the scripting window again, I have a tab here called Markdown Editor, but you won't have that. You probably won't have all of these tabs, but you can add them in the same way I have. So I'll hide the GUI for now. So at the top here, you can see there's a plus button to add a new tab. So you click on that, it says empty, you right click, and then you can choose Script Editor if you want another scripting window, or you can choose Markdown Editor for a Markdown Editor window. Another way to get this to open up, let's just delete that one. Another way to add a Markdown Editor tab is to go to the documentation over here in your floating tile, right click on it, and select Edit this page in New Editor tab, and it will automatically create a Markdown tab here. Let's just hide that again, I've got too many tabs. So it's created this one here, and it's opened the document inside of it. So we'll close that, we'll just stick with the one that I already have, but those are just two ways to add this Markdown Editor tab. Okay, so let's look at some of the controls we have here. So over here we have a settings button. This just brings up the standard HISE settings. I don't really know why we need another place to access it from, but it's there if you want it. Over on the left hand side we have a button that enables a live preview of the content that we edit here showing up over inside our floating tile. So you can just turn that on or off. We have a button to create a new Markdown document, a button to open one, a button to save the file we're currently working in, a button to add links to our document, one to add images, and one to add table data. Okay, we're going to click the open button, and this is automatically going to open the documentation folder of our project. So I'm just going to choose this readme.md document, which is at the root level. And what we can see here is the layout of our Markdown document. So it's split into two parts. So at the top we have what's called a YAML header, and YAML is just it's YAML. It's just another language, essentially, another sort of layout language, but it just refers to this header. So let's see which bits of this header match up to what we can see over in our panel here. And we'll close this widget list for now. There we go. So the keywords is basically the title that's going to show up in your table of contents. So we can see it says documentation tutorial here as well. And because this file readme.md is in the root of our documentation folder, this is the default document that will be displayed in our floating tile. Now, if you want to change the location of that, you don't want it to be in the root of the documentation folder, you can edit the floating tile's start URL property. So you can change that to something else if you want it to start in a different location. You can see by default it's just a / and that means the default location is the root of the documentation folder. Okay, the next thing, the summary. As far as I know, this doesn't show up in the Markdown panel, but it gives you an idea of what's going on in this file when you open it. The author is obviously, you'd put your name there. This is Christoph's tutorial, so it has his name. Modified, you just put the date when you modified it. You can also set a color value, that's a hex value, that affects the heading here in the table of contents and the color of all the children if they don't already have a color value themselves. There are some other properties as well that can go in this YAML header, and we'll look at those shortly. Okay, the next part is just some text, and this is just where you'd put your standard block of text, and you can see This tutorial covers the use of the markdown panel, and we've got that here. This tutorial covers the use of the markdown panel. This has backticks around it, so that's highlighted in the markdown panel over here. Now, if we were to remove these backticks, we'd want to see it update in the markdown panel. Now, what you're supposed to do is enable this live preview button. So we can enable that, and we can remove these backticks, and we can save the file. And as you can see, it hasn't updated in the markdown panel. I don't know why, but it doesn't seem to work at the moment. It seems to be a bit buggy. The other thing you're supposed to be able to do to achieve this is to hit F5, just like you would in the code editor to compile. But again, I haven't found that works. So what I do to refresh is I press this button over here, the rebuild interface button. And that refreshes it and loads in the changes. So it's a little bit irritating at the moment, but hopefully that'll be ironed out in the next release of HISE. So next we have some more text, and we have some other things going on in this purple text, which we'll get to shortly. It's also good to know that we can see the heading here, documentation tutorial. Again, that's taken from this keyword here. If I add an S on the end of that and refresh. Oh, hang on, I've got to save it first and then refresh. You'll see the S appears there as well. So that's taking it directly from this keywords section. So if we take a look at one of these subheadings, so we'll go to this one called setup. And again, we'll open it here. So it's a readme.md. So we can see this setup file has a lot of text, and if you can follow along with the table of contents as I scroll up and down, you'll see it'll go through the different headings there. And this has a purpley colour to it, which is set here by the colour value. We can change that to red if we wanted to. And we'll just save that and reload. So now it's got a red colour, and its children have a red colour as well. So these children are created by these headers here. We're going to look at this in more detail in a moment. I'm just sort of giving you the basic layout. One thing to note here is we have an index property in our YAML header. So this index, which always starts with 0, so if you wanted the number 1, it'd be 0, 1, for example. This allows you to control the layout of the table of contents. So setup has an index of 0, 0. Using TOC, I know already because I've checked the file, has an index of 1. And embed files has an index of 3. So that means there's a space between using the TOC and embed files. So if we set this to 2, it should move the setup group between using the TOC and embed files. So let's try that. And there we go. So it's moved it down one place effectively. So we'll put that back where it was. Okay, so let's create a new file, and we'll do some basic editing. So what I'm going to do in our folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and this is going to be our new section, and we'll call it editing. Now there is another little quirk with the Markdown editor. We're going to find a few of these as we go through, but here's another one. So we've created our editing folder. So to create our Markdown document, we could just create a text document in here and give it the correct name, readme.md. But if we use this button here to create the document for us, it will add this header. Now, I just want to draw your attention to something. If we look at these ones that already exist, for example, this one, readme, it's got a capital R at the beginning, and this one has a capital R, and this one has a capital R. So now we're going to create our own in the editing folder, and we're going to call it readme with a capital R, and I'm going to hit save. I'm going to hit OK. And it comes up with this: you need to use a valid URL for the name, no white space, no uppercase, and it's refused to create the file for us. Okay, even though we put an uppercase name, which is the same as all of these other ones are using. So let's try that again, and this time we'll do it lowercase. So we'll call it readme with a lowercase r, and it makes it just fine. And we can even open it in our Markdown panel. And now if I hit refresh over here, we should see the editing section appear in our table of contents. But we don't. And the reason we don't is it will only show up if it's got a capital R. So it's a really weird little bug. So we just need to replace this with a capital R. And then we need to reopen the document in the markdown editor. And then now if we reload, the editing section shows up. So it's a bit quirky at the moment. Hopefully these bugs are all going to be ironed out. But that one had me scratching my head for a while. But yeah, it must have a capital R, but the built-in tool to make the document won't let you use a capital letter. So the advantage of using the tool, of course, is it adds this default template text for us. So it's called editing, new file, our editing tutorial, author, me, and modified, it's put in the correct date, so that's handy. Okay, let's get rid of this text that's there, we don't need to see that. So we've got a blank canvas over here now. Let's just give us a bit more room so we can see what we're doing. And let's actually make that table of contents a bit smaller. We don't need it to be that wide. That's a little too small. Something like that. That looks okay. There we go. Okay, so editing. So basic text is just writing basic text. So this is some basic text. And if we have a look at that in our panel, we can see that comes out. It's just text. Okay, so you write your paragraphs like that, and that's how text is going to show up. So to do headings, you add a hash or a pound symbol or a number sign, whatever you want to call it. So you put a hash, and that means a level 1 heading. So level 1 is a big heading. So if we write level 1 heading, and we can see that's a large heading there. It's not as big as the main heading, which is the title of the document, but it's the largest heading we've got within our text. And you'll also notice that the heading shows up as a subgroup in our table of contents. Okay, to do a level 2 heading, a smaller heading, you put 2 hashes and then you write the name of your heading. So now we've got a level 2 heading, you can see it's a little smaller, and again it shows up in the table of contents. And to do a level 3 heading, it's going to be 3 hashes. So there's our level 3 heading, smaller still than the other two. This one does not show up in the table of contents. I don't know if you can do a level 4 heading, but we can try it now. So 4 hashes. I've never tried going this far into the layers of headings, but it will be interesting to see. So yeah, we have a level 4 heading, it's smaller than level 3, and presumably you can just keep going down, but pretty soon your headings are going to be the same size as the text, so that's pretty much as far as you're going to want to go, I think. We'll stop at level 3. Okay, let's look at some more text formatting, so I'm just going to paste in some dummy text here. So this is Lorem Ipsum Printer's Dummy Text. You might have seen this before. And it's just Latin gibberish, basically. So there it is. Let's put it a bit higher, actually. We'll have it under our heading 1. So to make this Lorem Ipsum phrase bold, to make the text bold, according to the HISE docs, you put 2 asterisks on each side to frame it like that. That doesn't actually work. You have to put 1. So it's 1 on each side, and if we save that and reload, we can see that this bit of text now is in bold compared to the rest. So that's how you do bold text. If you want to split some text onto a new line, so let's say we're going to put the split around here, you put 2 spaces. So 1, 2. And we can see it's come down to a new line here, so it's quite easy to do a new line. Putting a new line actually in the document, just like that, for example, doesn't make a new line within the markdown. So you do need those 2 spaces. So what I find best to do, because it's easier to read if you can split it into multiple lines here, is I put the 2 spaces at the end of the upper line. So if I put 2 spaces there and save it and reload it, we'll keep our layout that we've got there. And it makes it a bit easier to read. Now if you want to highlight text, we've already seen this, you just put a couple of backticks around it like that, and that highlights it. And it's nice that it shows up in the markdown editor to kind of give us a preview of what it's going to look like. It would be nice if the preview actually worked as well. So there we go, we've got our highlighted text there, we've got our bold text, and we've got our new line. If you want to insert some code into your documentation, I'm not too sure why I'd want to do this for the end user, but you may want to. You can put 3 backticks, write your code. This is just like we do it on the HISE forum. So I'll put some code in there, 3 more backticks, and we'll save and reload. And then this will show up as a piece of code in our documentation. The nice thing about this as well is it's got a little copy button here that the user can click to copy that code to the clipboard and actually paste it. So that's quite handy. And you actually might find this useful if you go through this documentation tutorial, because for example in this how to link section there is actually some code examples with the little copy button. Let's just paste in a bit more of that dummy text, just so we've got something else to work with here. Now we can't do underlined text, we can't do strike through text, and we can't do italics. What we can do is bullet points, for example. So you do a dash and then your points, so point 1, point 2, point 3, etc. We'll save this, reload, and there's our bullet point list. You can also do a numbered list, so you could do 1, 2 and 3, and that will be edited as a numbered list. So you just write number 1, then dot, number 2, then dot, number 3, then dot, etc. If you want to put a comment like an aside, you could use one of these, the little greater than symbol, and then write some sort of comment. So we'll just reload that. So this is a comment, and you can see it just sort of shows up as a highlighted block. That's the kind of thing it's useful for putting like editor's notes and things like that. If you want to do a link to another section of the documentation, that's really easy to do. So we put square brackets, and inside these square brackets we put the text we want to display. So we can put "this is a link," and then after the square brackets you put parentheses, and inside here you put the URL or the link you want to link to. So we're going to link to our setup document up at the top here, our setup section. We don't need to put a slash or anything because we already have the base URL. Let's just bring that back up. The start URL is set to a /, so by default this will, without anything else before it, it will just do /setup, which will take us to our setup header there. So let's save that, and we'll reload. And I'm still clicked on that. There we go. So if we scroll down, so here it is. This is a link. We can see it looks like a link. We're going to click it, and it takes us to the setup section. So that's really handy for sort of cross-referencing your documentation and linking bits into other bits. Now, another way to add links is to use this link button up on the toolbar. So if we click that, and we'll give our link a name, we'll call it "This is another link." And then the thing we want to link to, so we can link to the using the TOC section here, which I know is in the TOC folder. So we can just call this TOC. Is it going to be capitalized? It might be capitalized, but we'll put it in lowercase for now. TOC. Click insert a position. You can see that just does the same thing we did before, but it has that helpful interface. So we'll click OK and we'll reload, and we'll see if we've got that link right. So this is another link. Yeah, it takes us to the TOC section. So I'm guessing it's not case sensitive. Okay, let's look at sticking an image inside our documentation. Okay, to insert an image is quite similar to how we inserted a link. So this time we put an exclamation mark, then the square brackets, and we can put the image name in here. So image name would go in there, and then in the parentheses at the end we put the link to the image. Now I'm not actually going to do it this way, it's actually better in this case to use this tool that's built in. So let's use the tool. So if we go into our documentation folder, you can see there's a folder called images, and this is where all our images have to end up, and this tool will automatically put them there for us. So if we open this tool by clicking the button, it says select a file, and I've put an image on my desktop. It's a JPEG, so let's scroll down, JPEG, and we'll open that. And we can give the file a name, we'll just call it my image. We don't need to worry about the other stuff except this, where we set the size of it. We're going to put it to full size and click insert at position. Now, adding this should have also taken my image from my desktop and put a copy inside the images folder, inside our documentation folder, and inside a subfolder called custom, and it should have placed my image there. So let's have a look. Images, custom, and my image, which is called my-image.jpg, is not there. So this is another bug currently with the markdown panel, and this one's quite significant. I haven't been able to embed images into my documentation, and the documentation tutorial, the images don't show up either. This image, my file, doesn't show up. The SVG, however, does. So we'll take a look at that in a moment. But yeah, at the moment this is broken, but that's how you do it, and the file should appear in here. Now if we go to my desktop, here's the file. It's a nice picture of a piglet. If we just move that across manually into the folder, it still won't work, but that's where it should be. So we'll just reload just to double check, but I'm sure it's not going to work. No. So our image, this big gap that's appeared here, that's where our image should be, and it's just not there. If we go to the embed files heading, which is part of the original tutorial docs, this should have an image here as well, and you can see it's just left a big gap. So this is broken at the moment, but that's how you do it. So once it's fixed, this will be useful information. If we scroll down here though, you can see SVG images do work, which is interesting to know. If you are using an SVG, it will be loaded in at 100%. It'll be drawn at 100%, so it'll be really big like that. But when you add it using this tool here, you can choose a different size. So you can scale it. Okay, let's draw a table now. And tables can be drawn in Markdown using a text syntax, as everything can, but it's much easier to use this table generator, so we'll click on that. So number of columns, let's do 3 columns and 3 rows. We don't want an icon, so we'll ignore that and we'll just click insert a position. So that's what a table looks like. Let's just reload so we can sort of see the empty table. And even though I put 3 columns, it's only giving me 1 column. So let me show you how to add extra columns. So you can kind of see the layout here. It's a very sort of visual layout. Just number these. So yeah, you can kind of see that this layout sort of matches visually. And let's just reload that. That would be our 3 column layout and 3 row layout. So again, another tool that's a bit buggy. Okay, one thing we didn't look at was how to change the color of this text inside the Markdown panel. So let's just open up the property editor again, because this is where we do it. We can see we've got background color here, item color 2, text color, and item color 3. So these are fairly self-explanatory. We can see this one updates the headers, This one called text color is going to update the text. And this one updates links. The background color will update the background. And I'm not sure what this one does. Let's see if it does anything. Doesn't seem to do anything. Now, I recommend that you set this to the alpha to 0, so 0 opacity, and that way you can draw your background behind it and make it look whichever way you want. So that's my personal preference. A full customization is just put it in a panel and draw your background on a panel, or use an image. Okay, so that's pretty much it for how you use the markdown panel to edit your documents and to sort of customize the layout and things like that. Hopefully, as I've said several times now, hopefully all these bugs will be fixed. I'm sure there will be, and this will become a really useful tool. It's already being used in some projects. I think it's actually, these bugs are regression in later versions, because last year I was using it and I could do things like embed images and that worked just fine. So I think there's been some regressions, but hopefully they'll all be sorted out soon. Now, when you distribute this to your user, you don't want to be giving them this documentation folder with all the raw documents and the raw images and whatnot. So what you can do is you can export your documentation from here. Now, the way to do that is you right click, and what we want is this option here, export. I don't want to get into this too much, but there are two files systems for the documentation. There are two modes. One is the individual documentation files, which is what we're using here. These are the individual text files. The other is called a cache or cached system, and that basically compresses all these text files into its two single files. One of them's called content.dat, and the other one I've forgotten the name of, but we'll find out in a minute. And it also has a third file, which is a JSON file, and that's just a hash file to check the version the user's currently got, so that the server can update it if you were using the server update thing, which doesn't work at the moment. So for basic export, you just leave this as default, update local cached file. You can also click this help thing and it will give you some more information. And then you want to choose the location where your documentation repository is, which by default it should automatically go to your project's documentation repository, and this one has, so that's fine. The target directory is where it's going to put these files, and we can't change that for some reason. I think that's only if you choose a different mode. Yeah, it is, so we don't need to actually worry about that one. Oh look, I've unlocked it, there's a bug. But we can ignore that one. And then we just click OK. So basically you don't have to change anything in here. It says update local cache files. That one we've selected. So we just click OK. And then it says press OK to rebuild the indexes. This is a completely useless dialog that's popped up because it just says OK. So you might as well just do it anyway. Okay, so that's done. If we go to our documentation folder, you'll notice nothing has changed in there. And nothing has changed in here either. Now, I think it's meant to put the files into this folder, into the documentation folder. I'm not 100% sure where it's meant to put the files. But on my system, and I'm on a GNU Linux system, so this will definitely be different on yours, it puts it in my home folder. I don't know where it'll put it on your system. You'll have to check that yourself. But in my case, it's put it in my home folder. So these are the files it produces anyway, content.dat, hash.json, and images.dat. So you distribute these files to your user when you give them the plugin, and they need to go into the data folder for your sample library or your plugin. So this would be in the app data folder in Windows, or I think it's the library folder on a Mac. So they go in the data folder for the plugin anyway. So let's export this project and I'll show you where we put these files on my system. So I'm just going to export as a standalone application. And I've just got to run this file. It will only take a minute. So I'll let that go through and we will come back in a moment. Okay, we're back and here's the exported binary. I'm just going to open that. And we can see there's no documentation in there. So let's close this back down. So as I said, my documentation that we exported, those DAT files, have been put here. So I'm going to take them and I'm going to put them in the config folder for this new plugin called Markdown Tutorial. So again, you need to make sure that your installer is placing these in the correct location for your user on their operating system. But it's in the config files. So where are they? In my company, there we go, Markdown Tutorial. So they'll just go in here and they need to go into a folder called documentation. So put those in there and let's rerun this and hopefully, yep, there we go. So the plugin has found these compressed versions of the documentation and it's loaded them in. Now, a couple of things to notice is we've got our toolbar here. The table of contents button has disappeared. That might be because I was messing around with the colors, but that is actually still there, so we can hide and show the table of contents. So the lock button, which is usually over here, that's gone invisible as well. Again, I think it's because I messed with the colors. If I click on that, it's actually still there. And that is what the user will use to update from the server. But that doesn't work at the moment, and this dialogue's a bit complicated for your average user anyway, so hopefully that's all going to change. So that's it for this basic tutorial of the Markdown panel. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope I've given you some insight into how it works and what the current state of it is with the bugs as they are, and hopefully they'll all be sorted soon. It's a really good feature. It's definitely going to be in my next plugin that I release. Now, there are some other cool things you can do with this. One is you can link controls on your interface to sections of documentation. So the user, if they want to know what a particular control does on your interface, they can click it or click a button near it, and it will take them to the help documentation for that control. And that's a really useful feature. So for my $5 and $10 patrons, I'm going to be making an extra video, which will appear later this week probably. And that's going to cover how to add that feature in there as well. So if you're not following me on Patreon and you'd like to see that video, the link is in the video description on YouTube. So please go along there and take a look and consider supporting me on there. If you're watching this on YouTube, please click the like button and the subscribe button if you'd like to see more videos like this. I do post videos quite regularly, most of them on the subject of HISE scripting and sample library development. Got any questions or comments, please leave them below. And as always, thanks for watching.